Sony's PlayStation 3 is a legendary console. It has a ton of great games, was the first PlayStation console capable of HD and introduced the PlayStation Network. Even though it was difficult to develop games for it, this almost 20-year-old console still has a lot to offer. Because did you know that the PS3 can unofficially handle 4K and ray tracing? Yes, I said 3, not 5. I'm talking about the PlayStation 3. How is that possible? Well, let's find out in a Tech Insight episode. Hey everyone! As I said in the intro, the PlayStation 3 is a fabulous console. And hey, it's number 2 on my list of favorite consoles. Yes, the PS3. It was released in the USA on November 17, 2006 or on March 23, 2007 here in Europe, for a hefty price of $599 US. Well, that sounds cute nowadays compared to all other consoles. But when you factor in inflation, the price is $964 today. Ouch. But for that money, you got a real powerhouse. Yes, because it was an affordable Blu-ray player, a Full HD gaming console and so much more. And what powered the PS3 for all that was the cell processor. This chip was groundbreaking for its time. Sony developed this processor together with IBM and Toshiba for basically where everything a CPU is needed. Well, it would be worth it because the development of the cell processor cost $400 million US. And 400 people were involved in making this chip a reality. In 2006, the time had come for the cell to find its way into the PlayStation 3. And that's when things went wrong. Well, Sony had a very powerful chip for the PlayStation 3, which was incredibly fast and far superior to the Xbox 360. But what makes the cell different? How did it stand out from the competition? Well, the cell was a multi-core processor, which was relatively new at the time, with dual-core processors being the norm. The cell was different right from the start. It was an 8-core processor, something that was considered impossible at the time. However, the PlayStation 3 only had 6 cores available for games, as one core is for the system and another is deactivated. But still, a 6-core processor in 2006 is crazy. And it gets even crazier. Because the cores? There aren't ordinary cores, anything like that. They're called SPEs. And these SPEs are responsible for all the magic and the massive power of the PlayStation 3. You can imagine it like this. Or rather, let's compare it to a regular multi-core CPU. Think of the cores here as employees at a company. In normal processors, these cores are all-rounders, but they are not specifically trained for anything. This means that they get the job done, but they lack the experience to do it properly and quickly. And now comes the cell. Here, it's basically the same as with a regular multi-core CPU. The only difference is that the cores are highly trained and have been specially trained for their areas and responsibilities and anything that have a degree in Harvard and whatever else. And when these cores or SPEs are assigned specific tasks, they perform them with an efficiency and speed that leaves everyone else in the dust. And even in Apple's 2006 MacBook Pro, where Steve Jobs said,
"These things are screamers."
Yeah, and Sony was like that. Although the cell then became Sony's downfall. Because even though the PlayStation 3 had enormous and absurd computing power on paper, many of the games initially looked worse than on the Xbox 360. And why, you may rightly ask. Sony focused on providing the consoles with a lot of computing power, but didn't consider that the cell was made for gaming. And it was clear from the developers that this wasn't going to work out as well. Many didn't understand this architecture, and manually controlling the SPEs was very time consuming. With normal processors, tasks are automatically distributed to the cores, but not with the cell. So many people tried hard, but no one managed to make it work. And even Gabe Newell, the president of Valve, thinks that the PS3 is a total disaster for developers and that it would make a life as a developer more difficult.
The PlayStation 3 makes my life as a software developer much harder.
That's a big catch with the cell. It wasn't easily and had more in common with graphics chips. But no, wait a minute. graphic chip? Doesn't mean that the PS3 had 2 GPUs, so double is better? Well, that was the turning point for the developers, where they finally cracked the cell. Yes, because then many developers swapped roles for the PS3, and the processor did the graphics and the GPU does the processor data. That sounds totally absurd, but it finally allowed them to exploit the console's full potential. Games like The Last of Us looked great on the console, and many of the last PS3 games were real graphics marvels. And that's with a console that had a CPU that wasn't actually made for gaming, but for medical research. But even for complex mathematical tasks, weather modeling and other complex tasks, the Cell was used until 2017 as the Power XL 8i from IBM. So you can see, the Cell can do a lot with this power. And games like Okami were also rendered initially in 4K, but scaled down to 1080p in real time. And some fans managed it to enable ray tracing on the console. And not quite like with the RTX cards, but at least they got it working somehow. Which begs the question, is the Cell still good these days? The answer is a clear no. The Cell is powerful and still has a lot to offer. If it had more memory, a better bus and more modern manufacturing, it would be a real competitor to all other processors. But the architecture is simply too complex, inefficient and just doesn't fit into the world of tools, frameworks and like that. However, the design of the Cell has inspired other CPU manufacturers to incorporate cores that are specialized for a particular task. Examples here are the Neural Engine or H.264 decoder in the M1 or M5 chip. And then I think we've got it. Now you hopefully understand why the PlayStation 3 was and still is a very powerful console. Another very powerful thing is subscribing to this channel here, so you don't miss anything here. But well, then I can say, we'll see us